should we just go ahead and you get started with this?
Yeah, we can go ahead and first of all, welcome everyone. Yeah, and if everybody could remember to mute themselves so we don't get a lot of background interruption. We have had communication within the last few minutes. Actually, it's been going back and forth regarding the schedule. Okay, the United States Senate is scheduled to take an important vote. I'm not sure exactly what the agenda is, but we can well imagine. And is there somebody that needs to be muted? Yeah, I can see this.
Yes, but I wish I asked if I could have.
Okay, I just muted her. Okay, so the Senate was scheduled to have a vote this morning at a time that was very convenient for us. And then in a very rude manner, Chuck Schumer decided without consulting us to change the schedule. And what that means is that Tammy Baldwin will be available, excuse me, to be with us at 11:30 rather than right now. So she'll be on from 11:30 until 12:15 Central Time. So we've kind of, Terry and Kurt and I and Stephanie have sort of consulted with one another here and decided that, well, between now and 11:30 when Tammy can join us, we're going to have a kind of open discussion. And I can lead that off with a discussion about the Ukraine, which is on everybody's mind, I'm sure. And then we can open it up to other questions. There's the issue of the US Senate campaign that's going on now to determine who is going to serve with Tammy Baldwin. With that in mind, why don't I go ahead and Terry will do his usual wonderful job of moderating things. And Terry has also been asked to be sure, out of respect for Tammy Baldwin's schedule, to bring us to a close at, in this case, 12:15. So just be prepared for that. That's something that's pretty standard when we have discussions like this in any case. Well, I thought that one way of getting started on a discussion about the Ukraine is to talk about possible outcomes. I mean, we do know, and we can talk about the atrocities. There's no other word for it. The brutality of the Russian intervention. The invasion was totally unprovoked. But rather than sort of focus on that, we can talk about that. There's no question about that. I thought that it might be useful to talk about possible outcomes because that is obviously going to determine to some extent where we go from here. One possible outcome, obviously, is that the resistance by the Ukrainian freedom fighters, which was not anticipated apparently by the Russians, and what seems to be some inefficiencies and mistakes by the Russians has slowed down and made the Russian intervention much more costly in lives and material and the like and time than was initially anticipated. So one possibility, and I'll put it out there, is that the Russians say, oops, excuse us, and they withdraw. And we go back to a situation before they intervene and obviously need to take care of refugees and destruction and things like that. I don't think there are very many people who think that that is a likely outcome, but it certainly is a possible one. And there is precedent for that if we think about when the Russians got into Afghanistan. Before the United States got involved in Afghanistan, the Russians were. And the Afghanis made the Russian presence in Afghanistan so costly. Body bags going back to Russia, the cost, et cetera, et cetera. And this was without economic sanctions being imposed, that the Russians decided to leave. And then in all of our wisdom, we decided to get in ourselves. But that's a different issue. Another possibility, and I think the others are more likely ones, is that the Ukraine will be partitioned. The eastern and southeastern parts of the Ukraine have a lot of Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic people that live there. That's where they don't live to that extent in the rest of the Ukraine. So one possibility is that there would be a negotiation, that be a ceasefire, and that the Crimea in particular would be formally annexed to Russia and the area around it, so that the southeastern part of the Ukraine would be lost to Russia. That's a possibility. That's something that the Ukrainians are, at least at this point, saying that is unacceptable, but nonetheless, the war and the military effort may indeed force that. Another possibility that certainly has been talked about a lot is that the entire Ukraine would become part of Russia, that it would be something like the Russian intervention in Afghanistan, but it would be a more formal annexation of the entire Ukraine, that this would happen after what is begun as a long fight, particularly around the capital city, Kiev, and that would eventually lead to the Ukraine essentially running up a white flag and saying, okay, we've had enough. In that kind of scenario, guerrilla warfare, continued resistance is a really likely possibility. But the Ukraine would essentially be lost to Russia. That, to some extent, is really what Putin has, at least publicly, said he wants, and is publicly what he's saying is justified given his interpretation of history and the like. Another possibility is that either intentionally or unintentionally, there's a conflict that involves a NATO force, a NATO base, NATO equipment, NATO people from any of the NATO countries. But you would think, particularly like Poland and in the areas right bordering on the Ukraine, and that if the Russians and one of these forces got into a conflict and shot down planes, there was a military issue and there were casualties, that may then trigger off a more involved NATO involvement. And of course, the United States is a part of NATO, and that would bring us in as well. What it is a kind of conflict which, in terms of the United States, we could still do something like keeping our troops from being involved, no boots on the ground, but it would become a much more involved air war, anti-air, setting up the no-fly zone that the Ukraine would like. It would indeed involve all of the kinds of issues and risks that have been identified as the reasons why the United States and NATO generally has been very reluctant, and at this point saying we are not interested in a no-fly zone. It's just much too risky in terms of the military conflict with a nuclear-armed Russia. And in that regard, just having mentioned nuclear issues, I mean, Russia's obviously a major nuclear force in the world. Most people think that it is highly unlikely that nuclear weapons will get involved, that the scenario that would go from that is just so horrific and well understood on all sides that that's not likely. Clearly, it's possible, and in a tense military conflict, you can't always control everything that's going on. But there could be an escalation to involve NATO. Another scenario that is possible, and this is one that brings back memories of Hitler and World War II, is that, and this is a major reason why there is opposition to Putin and his invasion of the Ukraine, is that if he gets away with annexing the Ukraine, that's just going to whet his appetite for further expansion. He's openly talked about his feeling that the worst thing that has happened is the loss of territory, spheres of influence in the aftermath of the Second World War. So he might very well take steps to go into Moldova, to Georgia, Lithuania, Latvia. I mean, there are a lot of countries that had been the victims of the expansion by Hitler and Nazi Germany. And a number of years ago, Maxine and I were in Latvia, and boy, that was on everybody's mind. And Latvia is one of those countries, kind of like the Ukraine, where you've got still a lot of people who speak Russian and identify with Russia. And so the population is mixed in that regard. But boy, they remember like it was yesterday, even young people, the occupation by Nazi Germany, and then the occupation by Russia until the wall fell, and then what was then the USSR kind of dissolved. And understandably, they don't want that at all. That was a very harsh kind of occupation, and any occupation, of course, is unwelcome by people. So those are the possible scenarios. I guess one other issue that we might want to think about is China and its involvement. So far, China has taken a kind of an arm's length approach, not wanting to get too involved. And there are discussions that have begun, understandably, between US and Chinese representatives over the issue of whether or not China will step in and provide military support and some economic relief to Russia. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that the Chinese military equipment actually is newer and better than a lot of the Russian military equipment that's currently in the Ukraine. And so there's a request by Russia that Chinese equipment be brought in and help them out. So it's not so much Chinese soldiers, but Chinese equipment and materiel. And then the other issue is the sanctions. And the one threat to China, of course, is that, and this is apparently what they're indeed thinking about and concerned about, is that even though they're somewhat of an ally to Russia, that they don't want to be subject to the same economic sanctions that Russia is. That would really hurt their economy. Their economy is a little bit on the downside right now, anyhow. And if they had the same kinds of sanctions that are being placed on Russia and the Russian oligarchy, that could be pretty devastating, and they just don't want to go there. So we have to kind of keep our fingers crossed. And it should be remembered that China and Russia, although there is a kind of ideological link, there's also a historic rivalry between the two. It's not like they're bosom buddies. It's not, let's see, what would be, it's not like the United States and Canada. It's a very different kind of relationship. So why don't I?
Dennis, what do you think is the strategy about the European leaders going to Kiev today? Do you think that's to slow the damage, slow the bombing of the city, so that, because if they're there, who is it? Croatia, Poland, I can't remember who else, 3 or 4 who are going there by train, I think. Is that to maybe stop some of the bombing? Because if they get killed or hurt, that would bring obviously NATO into it pretty quickly, I would think.
Yes, I think you're right, Terry. And I think that indeed is a major reason why they're doing that, other than using Zoom or, some kind of virtual meeting. They can still confer, but they wouldn't have to do it in person and in Kiev. So I think that's a major kind of signal to Russia that NATO's serious. NATO is very serious about supporting Ukraine and not wanting Russian occupation. And that kind of message is especially important because the NATO countries have made it clear as well. They're not sending their troops. The NATO involvement is to provide material support, refugee support, things like that, but not to get involved with NATO troops actually on Ukrainian territory fighting against the Russians.
Do you think that Zelensky's talked to Congress today? I'm not sure what time it's supposed to be. I think this afternoon. Do you think? I mean, he's had lots of conversations with Biden and others. Do you expect anything? Can Congress change any of this, and as opposed to what Biden's been doing, and trying to? I mean, we all know that when we got into Vietnam, we really didn't have an idea why we're there, and if you can't really know what's going to happen if you go into this, you don't know where it's going to end. But do you think Zelensky has any chance to move Congress or anything else with that talk today?
Actually, I think isn't it tomorrow that he's?
It's Wednesday. It's Wednesday. It's Wednesday.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Right.
Today's Tuesday.
Yeah. Ides of March. Okay. Putin should watch out. Beware the Ides of March.
Yeah. I think that again, it's important. Symbols are important in this kind of situation, and I think part of what is going on is Zelensky is firming up his gratitude to the United States, and I think that's important. But I think the other issue is that he has been pretty open in public, and indeed, he has disagreed with Biden on like the no-fly zone, and so I think that there's a division in Congress. He may be to some extent thinking that he can get congressional support for his position that we have a no-fly zone. He certainly has been provided with a lot of aid, and he can use more in all probability. And I'm sure he's going to be asking for that. So I think it's both a combination of thank you very much, and please support us. If nothing else, support us even more, because we're going to need it. As you mentioned, we don't know which of these scenarios or something that doesn't even fit one of the scenarios I just outlined is going to happen. And in that kind of a context, it's important for people to be communicating and to set up whatever rules of the game they possibly can.
I've talked to several people who have spent time in Russia, and some as architects, some as environmental water work people working waters, and the people I've talked to who've been there said that the Russian people are actually very, they're very nice people, and they both made a distinction between sort of Soviet, using the word Soviet versus just the Russians. And so where else have you or other people, is that the experience other people have had like that?
Well, we have Russian students on campus. There are people from Russia in Madison, and we can get a lot of that firsthand. We also have people from Eastern Europe students and others, visiting faculty who are right in Dane County. And I think that there is a distinction that can be made rightfully between, number one, the people and their rulers, and the distinction between the Soviet and Russian is that the Soviet really refers to the various annexations and spheres of influence established by Russia after the Second World War. And that is distinct from Russia itself. I don't like to make a whole lot of historic Russian empires and going back generations and generations and having that be relevant for today. But I do think that we should remember that boundaries are really very arbitrary, and they do cut across cultural and historic groupings of people. There's the boundary between Minnesota and Wisconsin is arbitrary, and just about all those people on the other side of the border would wish that they were in Wisconsin.
Mm.
But there they are. They got to be Gophers.
They're going to wake up someday when the wind blows hard and wake up in Wisconsin on a good storm. Dennis, we got a couple of questions going on here. One is, obviously there's been a lot of appeal to the Russian people to be protesting, that they would stop their own government. And we obviously have been tons of arrests, even though they're facing the jail. And obviously the young woman yesterday with Russian TV who put her video out of what she was going to do and then did it, and is in court today on the administrative charges of it. But what do you think that there's a chance that they will refuse to go along at some of this point? That it will rise enough?
Well, Russia has always had dissent, and it rises and falls in part because of what's going on domestically and internationally. And as I mentioned, when Russia had invaded Afghanistan, and they were there for a good decade, and Russian bodies were coming back in body bags because of the casualties, that generated a lot of opposition and a lot of dissent. And I think that there's a sense that there could be a similar scenario here. Russian dissent takes place with a great deal of risk and a great cost. Even in a period with less visible tension, we know of the cases of Russian officials poisoning other dissenters and using poison. And that's raised a concern about the use of chemical warfare. Russians were involved in the Syrians' use of chemical warfare. So they can be pretty brutal in putting down dissent or reacting to dissent. And it's amazing to me, and I think it is to most of us, that even with the risks involved, people are feeling strongly enough that they're voicing their opposition to the war and to other kinds of activities. I remember when I was chair of political science, one of the faculty hires that we made was somebody in Russian politics. And it was interesting. We were filling a position that we determined was Russian politics. Up until that time, the study of Russian politics was often referred to as Kremlinology, in which what you would do is you'd study and make a great deal of interpretation on who was standing next to whom at parades among the Kremlin leaders. And that's about all the information you could get. Well, on the one hand, the study of Russian politics and Russian society, what's going on, is much easier today because of technology. And there is more of an openness now than there had been. But the other side of it is that there still is a lot of this real crackdown on dissent, people suffering. One of the things that quickly became obvious is that our expert in Russian politics was actually an expert on Russian corruption. because the way that that government and their economy worked was more not by rules of the game, but by corruption, and it was primarily financial corruption that was involved. So it's a on the one hand, you can take a step back and say, wow, what a fascinating place. But if you're living there and you're asked to sacrifice members of your families, and you're sacrificing your freedom, and they're sacrificing economically now, that's a lot to be asking for. That doesn't mean that it translates into regime change. And I think we've got to be very, very careful about hoping too much for that kind of dynamic. That's a real long shot.
A couple of questions from folks about the comparison with China and Taiwan. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Is this going to embolden China to do it?
Well, I think there is some expectation that China will, in its talks, and they may already have brought it up, saying, well, there's kind of a parallel between the territories that Russia regards as really Russia, but have been taken away from them because of the way that the West drew the boundaries after the Second World War, and the fact that Taiwan is really a part of China, and because of the aftermath of military activity and diplomatic maneuvers, it is not, let me just, excuse me, just wanted to mute somebody there. That there may be some bargaining that's going on, reminding of the parallels in history, and saying, well, if you don't want us to get involved in helping out Russia, here's something that we really would like to get resolved. Now, there are a lot of other issues that are not as symbolic and I was going to say significant, but that's the wrong word, that China could be really using this as leverage for in its discussions with the United States. One of them is the presence of China in the Chinese Navy in the seas around China. That's been an issue, not as visible as some of the others to most people in the United States, but China's been artificially constructing islands and then putting military equipment and military bases on these artificial islands. They've been pushing the envelope in terms of where their warships, their Navy goes, pushing out in terms of fishing rights. And that could, I can well imagine that there may be a resolution of some of those kinds of disputes too. But yeah, if you or I were working for China, I think that we would probably say, hey, we got a little bit of leverage here. United States really wants something from us, and let's use it.
It never occurred to me that would be a bargaining point for this. That would be a way to come around it. Interesting question here about the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church who came out for Putin and the war. Any idea how that leader, how that might really sway the average person's thinking? Any about where religion comes in on this?
Well, my understanding, and this is second, third hand here, is that the Russian people generally are not that religious, particularly the younger people. So I'm not sure that
artificial boundaries.
Yeah, and it's a sort of, there've been some criticism of the Pope for not being, of the Roman Catholic Church, for not coming out more forcefully against Russian action. I think that's probably that issue might be a bit more important and impactful than the Russian Orthodox Church.
So a couple of questions about the impact of the sanctions. You think Russia will actually default on the loans? Do you think that they're starting to actually be felt?
Well, typically sanctions take time to have an effect. Interestingly, the sanctions that President Biden and the European leaders have focused on are ones that take long-term effect, but they also have an immediate effect. And it's interesting that some of the effects are on the Russian oligarchs. It's a kind of recognition of the politics and the governance of Russia, that it's really not a democracy. And so you go after the people in power, and those happen to be the oligarchs who are benefiting from the current situation. So I think that those are much more forceful than anyone thought. I think they're much more forceful and immediately impactful than Putin was anticipating. And in part, the surprise is that these sanctions, I mean, first of all, Russia is really, maybe we don't fully realize this, but Russia is really a tiny actor in the world economy. Very small actor, not anything like the major European countries, with the exception for oil. And oil and gas is something that they're not a major factor. They're not like the Middle Eastern countries. They're not like Saudi Arabia, but big enough so that they can affect oil prices in the United States and especially in Europe. And so the sanctions have been costly from that standpoint. And interestingly, and I take some of the sort of immediate polls with a grain of salt, but the polling that has been done just recently indicates that that United States citizens and Europeans as well are saying, well, I'm willing to pay a higher price for a gallon of gasoline to try and make these sanctions work and punish Russia for what it's doing. It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon.
One thing that I thought might be interesting that I was reading, and maybe you guys have all seen it too, but Kiev and Chicagoland both have about 5 million people. But trying to put into perspective exactly how big Ukraine is and where this war is going. One thing that I was reading with this said that it's basically having Chicago being bombarded by artillery and ballistic missiles, and running battles between between Iowa and Ann Arbor, Michigan, with Sandusky, Ohio being destroyed by bombardment and fighting, and heavy fighting in the Ohio River Valley from Evansville, Kentucky to Cincinnati, Ohio. And don't forget that 2 million refugees have fled into Kansas and Missouri. So when you figure about how big Ukraine is, and you realize it stretches that far with it, it just brings it home in terms of how tragic and how brutal and how awful this thing is. But you see that kind of size. So one other question about that, in terms of that is not knowing what the sanctions are going to do, long-term effects on the trade and globalization. I mean, we don't know where our sanctions on Russia are going to hurt us and disrupt the fabric of the trade and globalization altogether. And I guess that's seems to me that's one of the questions somebody has, is that wondering if this is going to accelerate movement of rending that kind of garment and not knowing where it's going to happen when the trade pacts and patterns are disrupted.
Yeah, and there are a number of economists who indeed think that, particularly when you combine this with the pandemic, that there are going to be some profound changes in the United States economy, and that supply chain issues are not going to be ones that necessarily involve other countries, that we're going to try and become much more independent. And that certainly, it makes sense. Whether, the extent to which that happens is obviously to be determined, especially when there still is going to be a lot of globalization. It may not involve Russia, but if you're an investor in a particular, in producing a particular product that's needed around the world, and you can do it cheaper and better in a European country, for example, or in Latin America, you might well do that rather than in the United States. So it's not as simple as a kind of one-for-one implication.
Well, and one of the, again, a question or comment going on from somebody is thinking about the fact that we used to export 25% of our grain, and the grain now it's down to about 13 because of our laws and doing ethanol. So we're not exporting 25% anymore. We're down to that 13, and yet Ukraine and Russia then, of course, are we're not importing that, but around the world. We don't know what this disruption will be literally for food for people in terms of food yet. And food shortages, particularly in poorer countries, and the other things that come out of there, whether it's fertilizer and the rest. So we've got, again, back to that point that one of the participants made is that, yeah, this is not over to try to figure out where this is finishing yet.
Right. And, the Ukraine is a real breadbasket for Europe. It's a major producer of grains.
Yeah. And one of the things that Kurt pointed out, and I know talking about the effects of the sanctions, I'm trying to figure out what's happening with inflation around the world. Today, I think the Federal Reserve, Kurt, you're saying they're looking at a 0.25% raise.
Yeah, quarter percent is what they're projecting. My guess is there's going to be an out of band another raise coming up. I mean, they got to hit this balancing act between putting our economy into a tailspin and curbing inflation.
And again, it's not just U.S. not just U.S. going through this.
But yeah, the production of you talk about Russian wheat, Russian grains, but also they produce 15 to 20% of the fertilizer that we use in our fields, right? Comes out of Russia. So that's all. It's going to cause an increase in cost of production here as well. Mm-hmm.
So there will be other. I know they're looking for the soft landing, supposedly, and found a sweet spot with this, because again, not just with the Ukraine stuff, but what's happening domestically for us.
So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they come. I do think the market's expecting a 0.25% increase, so it won't affect the market much today. I don't think, unless they say, "Oh, we're gonna raise it by half," that will send the market down.
Dennis, there's a question of what you thought about the president of Finland coming here, and as someone who just figured out the Winter War, even though I'm 70 years old and I've never really studied the Winter War between what Finland did when they were invaded. It's really fascinating to see how their resistance. I mean, they ultimately lost and they were overtaken before World War II or during it. But any thoughts about that about the Finland president?
Well, I think that the context there is in part the Winter War that you mentioned, a fascinating story and easy to romanticize in a way, and a statement historically, but I think also currently, of the concern that people that border Russia have of Russia expansion and Russian occupation. And I think that the main reason why Finland came to the United States and the two presidents got together was again a statement to Russia that we're not going to go through the kind of thing that we went through before. We're going to resist. And yeah, as you point out, they resisted and they lost, but the longer term part of history that one might point out is that they eventually won and they got their independence back, and they're a free country now and they want to stay free. And one of the concerns that Putin keeps talking about is the expansion of NATO. Well, ironically, he's really pushing a number of countries like Finland that border Russia to join NATO as a way of having the the one for all kind of principle of defending countries that get invaded by Russia.
Yeah, and I didn't, it didn't make sense to me when I first tried to understand the history of this. Is that Russia invaded because they thought Finland would allow Germany to come through, and so it seems like Finland was just stuck with that. But yeah, as you say, the romanticism of all the snipers. I mean, I think they killed 150,000 Russians, and they lost 35,000 or something. Finland, soldiers and citizens who came in, and it was, just rereading it with this is, the Russians are coming in with giant tanks, and you can hear them, and the Finns are using reindeer to pull their equipment through the woods, so you can't hear them. They go back, and one of the classic things that I thought was funny with this is that we've all seen those when you try to sign in, and it has all the squares and say what is not in these squares. And there's a picture of just a snowdrift picture in Finland, and all 9 squares, and it says, check everyone that doesn't have a Finnish sniper in it, which of course you couldn't see them. I mean, the snow that Russia just didn't understand.
Right.
They were totally not ready for it and totally misread it, which of course is where part of what I think what you said today, the same way, just misreading it. And Zelensky obviously didn't run, didn't hide, and has rallied. And it'd be so curious, I think, for you, Dennis, and future political scientist folks to look at that and say these nightly talks that he gives. I was thinking of the radio, the FDR. It's been phenomenal.
And for a lot of people, and I'll bet Putin is in this camp, Zelensky's a real surprise. I mean, think about this guy. He was a comedian, and got elected, and we didn't really have anything looking at his background or his history to suggest that he would be a courageous leader that would be arguing for Ukrainians to resist, to unite, and to stand up to Russia. And I suspect that Putin probably thought that Zelensky would probably fold pretty quickly. And obviously that's not happening. In a lot of other situations, when a country is attacked like that, the head will go into exile, save their own hide. And Zelensky is right there in Kyiv and talking to his people and saying, and the odds, I mean, the odds of the Ukrainians winning are not very great, given what they've got in terms of military power, both in personnel as well as equipment, even with all the support from the West, which has to be indirect rather than direct involvement.
Yeah.
By the way, I should probably make a comment. A number of people have come on late, and our schedule is this morning is such that Senator Baldwin is going to be with us. Let's see what in about another 15 minutes. She had to adjust her schedule because of a vote in the U.S. Senate that was scheduled this morning. So she's planning on being with us from in 15 minutes, and then for 45 minutes after that. So until 12:15.
We're keeping our fingers crossed. There have been how many emails in the background of this for the past week? So things change.
Things change. Yeah.
Yeah. As an old journalist, one of the mea culpas that I think are really interesting in the media with this coverage of Ukraine is how basically the media said we're covering this because they look like us, meaning white Europeans. Is sort of,
Mm-hmm.
and the media I think has taken a lot of deserved hits about how does that work with Syria. How's that worked with Libya? How's it worked with lots of other places where they don't look like, meaning I guess white, and so it's been very humbling for me to look back on the coverage of things that have happened with Aleppo and even going back to the Serb-Croatian Bosnia War, looking at that and the coverage of it and how that's so different than what's happened right now. And this is staying right on the front page of the New York Times, 3/4 of the front page, I mean, almost every day. So there's still a lot of other, they had a map of where else, who got bombed yesterday in the world. And it's amazing to see how many places are getting bombed that are not Ukrainian, places that we're bombing. So it's an interesting thing to look at and read and distill the media coverage, trying to understand, what does that mean?
Yeah, good point. And the other thing that, especially knowing some journalists, that I have come to really appreciate is the courage of journalists who do the covering. And we've heard already of some casualties, and a lot of the journalists, this is a point separate from Terry's, but a point that I think is important for us to keep in mind is that a lot of these people are really risking their lives to bring us the coverage.
And I would encourage you, if you are trying to follow this, there have been a number of, I get a couple of papers here, but I follow on Twitter, and I follow the writers who have been covering this for a long time. And if you do a little research on it, you can go first, you can find the Kiev Independent, the newspaper itself, and follow that if you want to keep up with what's happening with it. And then there's also obviously the journalists who are there, from everything from CNN to the BBC, all kinds of folks who are there. And and the way I follow things like this is I follow the writers themselves, not necessarily their outlet. And then you also get it a little bit earlier, and you get a lot more context to what's really going on by hearing that. And that's true of every issue. If you want to do our border with Mexico, there's 4 or 5 really good journalists who follow that and know what's going on. And it's also the kind of people I look at before I click on something or before I retweet or like something, because I know where it's coming from. I know who they are. And I know it's not new to any of you probably, but there are a number of folks out there. There is a journalism group that got going, they pulled together as soon as it started, and you can follow that and pick up other people within it. So. I'm trying to see what else we have. Oh, someone says Egypt imports a great deal of corn and wheat from Ukraine. They're already experiencing a great deal of food inflation. Is there a realistic sense? Is there a realistic sense in the long term that sanctions alone will bring about a desirable outcome?
Probably, I don't think so. I mean, sanctions alone have never really had that kind of an overwhelming impact. Even when we're talking about like the sanctions against Cuba, for example, pretty serious sanctions by the United States over a long period of time. We know that Cuban people have suffered. Their economy has suffered and had to make adjustments, but it hasn't really brought about regime change or a major change in the way they govern themselves. And you really, I mean, North Korea, you can go around the world where sanctions have been placed, and you really are not going to find an example where sanctions alone really make that much of a difference. Having said that, we haven't really seen sanctions like the ones that have been imposed on Russia. There's sanctions worldwide. There's sanctions on their banking system, sanctions on the oligarchs, which I think is a critical kind of distinction here. So these are serious sanctions, but even recognizing that, hard for me to think that sanctions alone are going to make a difference, because the causal link that you've got to make here is that the sanctions are going to be so onerous to somebody that they force a change in the leadership of the country. And, the most likely scenario that would come out of something like that is the oligarchs that would have a change in leadership. Russia has had oligarchs killing off one another in the past, and somebody could do that. Putin used to be in the KGB, so he's a pretty savvy kind of guy, and he knows about his own personal security. I doubt that that's going to happen. And it's certainly not the kind of society, I mean, Putin is not going to be voted out of power. There's not going to be a referendum. So you really can't make that causal link between sanctions and political change that ideally we might want.
Somebody's asked about put together some Ukraine reporters, and I will, and I'll send that out later. Another one, obviously, to follow is Colonel Benman, since he knows it well and is from there. I mean, he knows it really well. He had one of his interviews this past week said that Russian intelligence and Russian military don't get along necessarily, and that there perhaps if some change is happening, it's that, and sometimes it's jealousy. I know when I was at the Kennedy School and taking a class in negotiation, the Kennedy professor, the Harvard professors were going out to negotiate to help Russia get out of Afghanistan. That's what they were doing. And one of the ways they figured out that Russia finally got out of Afghanistan is because the Russian Navy was not involved, and they were upset that they were not involved in this war. So they're saying, this is a stupid war. We don't need this war. And so part of getting Russia out of Afghanistan came from inside, because all the military units want to be involved, and I can't do it. So it's a stupid war, it's odd, but that's how negotiate. That's how you do conflict resolution. You find out the other person, or what is it? What is it they need? What would they want? Like what you're saying, Dennis, about China and Taiwan. Are they going to use that, to be able to leverage? But anyway, to me, that was really fascinating. One person asked here is, do you think that the amount of defense, and does this make upend the liberals' argument about our defense spending? Because we see what could happen and what's at stake.
I frankly think that spending on defense is such a powerful force within our government that it's not affected by much of anything. If the military says it needs something, they get it. If people think that there's a resolution by spending more in the Defense Department, that happens. I know a joke at one time when we were talking about the war on poverty is that what would really be useful is to have the food stamp program located in the Defense Department. Then it would have all the resources that it needs. And I think that's unfortunately very true. So, I think this reinforces, in other words, an existing dynamic of deferring to the military when it comes to spending money.
Well, I think that same kind of dark humor was applied under the Walker administration to the UW system, where the thought was, if we declare ourselves a prison when we're at UW, right, we'd have all the guards, we'd have raises, corrections. So, we keep building. And as Tommy now admits, he built too many prisons. But it's taken him, it's taken him 20 years to admit that. But the same thing, just reclassify us as that.
Right.
Let's see the other here. Okay, I think that's caught up on our comments and questions with this. While we have a chance before everybody goes, before she shows up, theoretically, in 2 weeks, we're having the professor who's a postdoc at University of Washington, who is going to talk about information and disinformation. I believe that's next week. It might be Monty, but 2 weeks. I don't have my list with me right here.
2 weeks, yeah.
All right, in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so knowing what we knew at the time about information and disinformation on everything from the racial stuff with Black Lives Matter to the election. Now we add Ukraine to this, to the whole discussion in 2 weeks about what is misinformation, what is disinformation. And so that's still coming out there, and then we'll be looking forward to seeing what that is. Somebody comments that it seems that the current situation emphasizes the importance of NATO. You addressed that a little bit, Dennis. You want to add something to that?
No, I indeed, I agree with that. I think this gives real meaning to NATO. And I don't think that Putin anticipated that. I don't think he anticipated the unity that would occur. And I don't think he anticipated the kind of dynamic that we're seeing from Finland and others that to join NATO as a way of defending themselves against similar invasions from Russia. So
Yeah,
the unity there has been pretty outstanding, and that's been true about the refugees. I mean, when we see, for example, Poland and how it has been receiving refugees, and there was a newscast about some people from Denmark going down to Poland and holding up a sign at one of the train stations, inviting 8 of the refugees to get into their van and go back to Denmark with them. Wow, I mean, that kind of way of dealing with the human cost is pretty amazing.
Can you explain exactly how someone gets into NATO? I mean, I know there's now going to be several other people thinking they should be. Do you have that kind of?
Yeah, they're at this point in history, the country has to ask they have to ask NATO, and the NATO countries all have to agree. And there's a criteria that includes internal democracy and not having a lot of corruption and things like that. And when the Ukraine earlier had toyed with the idea of joining NATO, it was turned down because they were not a robust economy and there was a fair amount of corruption. And so that application really didn't go very far. But of course, the other part of it is that if you join NATO, you have to join with the notion that an attack on one is an attack on all. And you've got to be prepared to make your contribution to defending countries that may not be bordering you, you may not identify with necessarily, but they're NATO members.
What do you think the invasion, how does the invasion impact Trump's chances of running again or of winning?
That's a good question, and I don't know what the answer is to that, in part because he's waffled all over the place. I think we all remember when initially he called Putin a genius for the way he was pursuing this. He got a lot of pushback by other Republicans, and then he backtracked and called it horrendous and a really terrible thing that was developing. So this is something that most Republican leaders that have spoken out on it have joined with Democrats in saying this is really, we've got to support the Ukraine and we've got to support NATO, but not all Republicans. And so it raises that general issue of, well, who's your base and how extreme you're going to get to get the people in your base.
Well, his rally in South Carolina obviously did the full circle on and many of the people there are saying that Russia is invading Ukraine because there are terrible biolabs there that are going to release things like COVID, and Russia's invading to protect us and protect everybody. And so when you have that kind of fringe on the right promoting that, and then it ends up being on Tucker Carlson and the rest, I just have to wonder how big of a group is this, but it's still obviously big enough of a group that they show up.
Right, right. Yeah, and then, there was a statement that the Ukrainians were bombing their own hospitals, just as a way of providing footage they could use to get us upset with Russia. I mean, yeah, just sort of crazy kinds of things.
Well, I'm wondering if, when we have the midterm elections, Trump has now endorsed many, many people. And once he's endorsed, a lot of their campaigns are sort of falling apart. And I'm wondering and so more Republican mainstream are pulling back from that, or they're not going as much with him. But I'm curious to see what happens in the midterm, whether or not the people he's endorsed end up being not winners, and that will certainly tamp down some of the enthusiasm for what he's doing or wanting his support in the future with that.
Right. So I see that Senator Baldwin has joined us. Is that right?
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Take it away, Dennis.
Great. Let's see. Let me. Can everybody see Senator Baldwin?
Yeah. Oh.
You can. Okay.
She's right next to me.
No, I guess some can't. Let me see if.
Oh, there she is. I see her. Okay.
You can highlight her for everyone if you want.
There we go. Does that?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much, Senator. Thanks.
Oh,
Let me
thank
just
you.
give let me just give a real brief introduction. This is tempting, of course, to say this is somebody who needs no introduction, but Senator Baldwin is a product of Madison, a graduate of Madison West, and so she knows Wisconsin and she knows the Madison area very well. Graduate of Smith College and then UW Law School, and then kind of immediately started public service on the Madison Common Council, Dane County Board, was elected to the Assembly in 1992, and then to the House of Representatives representing the Madison-Dane County area, and to the Senate in 2012, and then reelected in 2018. And notable for a couple of things in terms of policy, certainly health. She's been a major spokesperson on health and innovator in terms of legislation and public policy. Really very strong advocate for helping students who have gotten loans and getting some relief for that and some sense there. I had the distinct pleasure of working with Tammy Baldwin when I was directing the pay equity effort in Wisconsin, and that, not surprisingly, Tammy, I think we all know, is a very strong advocate of equity, giving everybody a chance, regardless of their background and identity. So the other thing that I might mention, because we kind of talked occasionally in our Plato sessions, Senator Baldwin, about the election coming up and your, I was going to say colleague, but I shouldn't use the term colleague, Ron, whatever his name is, in making a, sort of concerned about him and concerned about the Democratic candidates and their chances against him. And one of the issues that has come up a lot in our discussions is the amazing way in which you have been able to get support from throughout the state of Wisconsin. And I know that you did that when you first got elected to the House, and then now in the Senate, where you go around the state, you meet people face to face, a lot of grassroots support. And it really had the effect of allowing you to, indeed, surprisingly to many of us, defeat a candidate who was a popular governor who everybody knew. And, here, this gay woman from Madison knocks him off, holy cow. So congratulations and thanks for providing a model for how people can get elected.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And maybe I'll launch a little bit into that first before attending to some of the topics that you've asked me to say a little bit about. There was a lot of, I guess, interest in, especially my reelection campaign in 2018, where a lot of change took place, but most of the seats that flipped, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the state treasurer, the margin of victory was about 1 point in each of those races. And I had, I don't want to be boastful, but nearly an 11-point margin of victory in 2018. And, a lot of people asked me to try to explain that. And one of the people that I would credit with sort of articulating how I pulled that off is a colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Catherine Kramer, who wrote that incredibly insightful book about the politics of, somebody give me a
Resentment.
Politics of resentment, that sort of followed how Scott Walker got into office. But if I were to simplify it or even oversimplify her thesis from it, it was that showing up matters because rural voters in particular feel unseen and unheard. And so showing up matters, especially when somebody like me shows up in places that maybe they weren't expecting me to show up, right? And that I do listen, not just assert whatever it is. And then the second, I think, thesis of her book was that a lot of our rural voters feel disrespected, perhaps because we don't show up all the time as Democrats. And then lastly, a sort of frustration that that resources, public resources, taxpayer dollars are distributed in a manner that rewards those who are maybe not as deserving. And that may be code for some other troubling ideas. But what I would say is that when you do show up, when you do listen, when you treat voters with respect and have plans around their strongest concerns, that can compensate for a lot of the partisan divide that we have and the rural-urban divide. I will tell you a couple of fun stories just on playing this out for me. You may know that I'm a big fan of Buy America policies, because I think about things that are critical, either critical infrastructure or critical to our nation's security or public health, given the lessons learned in the pandemic, that we need to be able to make certain things here in order to be safe, secure, and healthy. And so I was visiting Neenah Foundry. I think everybody knows about Neenah Foundry because they make manhole covers and a lot of things that we use in improving our surface transportation infrastructure. And the guy who basically operates the machinery that brings the molten iron across the factory floor, foundry floor, and then pours it into the mold. He, by the way, looks like he's from Central Casting. I would have cast him in that role. And anyways, I'm there, and it's in the middle of the Trump administration, and he says to me, sort of pointing that finger, "You got to lay off my guy Trump." I laughed to myself. It's like, "Why are you always picking on him?" I said, "Well, sometimes I think he deserves it." And anyways, we had this lighthearted exchange. And then somebody who was with me went up to him afterwards and says, "Do you support Tammy Baldwin?" And he says, "Of course I do. She supports Buy America, just like my guy Trump." And I thought that was such an interesting, anecdote. And I found that also in, among dairy farmers who, had strong, many of them strong support for Trump, but also saw me show up over and over again, trying to work with dairy farmers on how do we work both in the short term and in the longer term to make farming be able to support a family again, because we're not there. And I think that there's a lot of appreciation for those efforts, even if we may disagree on many other issues. So I think that's part of the explanation of how it happens. But I know you wanted kind of an update on what's going on right now in Congress and in the Senate, and so I thought I'd cover very quickly a number of issues, and then we can, in discussion, get into any of these more deeply. I think that in terms of a pivot that you'll see right now, especially from the Democrats, is a real focus on lowering costs. I would say, if you look at Democrats are often criticized for not messaging very well about what we're doing. And we have left unretorted months now, a couple months now, of Republican messaging on inflation and trying to attribute that inflation to President Biden as opposed to the pandemic or gas prices on the war in Ukraine. And so we intend to respond both through policy as well as rhetoric. And so you will see action on efforts to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. We are hopeful that we will be able to pass at least one smaller bipartisan measure to reduce the out-of-pocket cost for people with diabetes who rely on insulin, which has shot up in price over the last decade, doubling, sometimes tripling for people who need it as a lifeline. And we are moving forward with a bill that we hope will become bipartisan, that would cap out-of-pocket costs for insulin at $35 a month. We also will be advancing a larger bill aimed at once and for all getting Medicare permission, because right now it's illegal for Medicare to negotiate with the big pharmaceutical companies to lower prices. That's why one of the big reasons why prices are so low, comparatively speaking, in other developed nations than they are in the US. And so that is less likely to secure 60 votes needed to pass legislation. But we think we can hopefully pass a smaller bill focused on the one medication, insulin, and then follow through with grander legislation, bolder legislation that will show the American people who's actually has a plan to lower costs versus those who are complaining about them but not doing anything. Likewise, with the gas prices shooting up, there are lots of concerns there. First of all, I have to just start with price gouging. While we announced the intention to stop importing gas from Russia, which accounts for somewhere between 3 to 7% of our overall imports or our overall use, any ship that has set sail already is still going to come and deliver. This will only apply to future shipments, so that price shooting up is more on speculation of some shortage ahead. And so we have to just really beware of the opportunity for these companies to price gouge, and really make sure that our regulatory agencies are investigating that fully. We also, if there's windfall profits being made, we also need to consider taxing big oil's windfall profits. And there's a bill that I've joined, sponsored by Senator Whitehouse, to do just that. I would agree in this very unique circumstance of aggression and conflict and war in Ukraine, to suspend the gas tax through the end of the year. I'm a little, I understand the downside of doing that, but I do think it's going to be so critical to try to do everything we can to lower the costs of people, especially in rural America, who rely on their automobiles to get to the grocery store, to work, to school, every place they need to be. We also can continue to tap our strategic petroleum reserve, and we can increase the production of biofuels. Frankly, our capacity is almost equal to it could almost offset what's being imported, what has been imported from Russia. So we'll also, I think, in terms of lowering costs, talk a lot about a bill that has had several names as it's gone from the Senate to the House and now back to a conference committee. But it's focused on supply chains and reducing our dependence on long supply chains that are primarily offshore and particularly in China. Whether it's talking about producing microchips in the US in increasing percentages, or many other critical items like the PPE we needed during the early stages of the pandemic. This will lower costs by reshoring more of this type of manufacturing and production. And I also am responsible for an amendment that is a part of that bill. We call it the Cool Online Act, but COOL standing for Country of Origin Labeling. People want to be able to be informed as consumers about where what they're purchasing comes from. That is required in retail settings, in Main Street and tangible retail settings. It's not required online. And it would be very simple for manufacturers who are marketing their products online to add information about where they are produced. And that has been accepted as an amendment, and I'm pleased about that. One of the reasons I was very tardy today was that I was in the HELP committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, doing a markup on a bipartisan bill called the Pandemic Response Package, or Prevent Pandemic Act is the title. And it's really much more about incorporating lessons learned during COVID-19 to prevent the next potential pandemic. Where can we get a head start where we found ourselves behind? And several of the bills that I have introduced on a freestanding basis were incorporated into that act. For example, the Biopreparedness Workforce Act. We learned that we have a desperate shortage of infectious disease workforce people. And this isn't necessarily doctors and nurses, although we have shortages there too after the pandemic. This is more people who run tests, do research, are laboratory employees and hospital employees that do things related to infectious diseases. And it creates a loan repayment program to incent more individuals to go into these fields and to replenish the workforce that has taken a real hit, so that we're ready for the next pandemic. We also, I got partial inclusion of a bill that I would love to have seen wholly incorporated in the measure, which is called the Disease X Act. What I will tell you about the Disease X is we don't know what disease, what viral family will be driving the next pandemic. But we do have enough knowledge to know that it's probably one of several likely families of viruses. And I think we should make a greater commitment in advanced research to get to know those viral families a little better, because they are the most likely to become the next pandemic. And we could be much further ahead in treatment development, vaccine development, if we have greater knowledge of these viral families. And while I did get language in the bill to have NIH work much more closely with a group called BARDA, which is Advanced Research and Development, Biological Advanced Research and Development Agency. This is encouragement for them to work closer together. My Disease X bill would have said you're required to work more closely together and advance research, and it would have also authorized funding so that they can capably do that. Just a couple more things I want to touch on. We're all horrified to be watching the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just last week, through our appropriations legislation, we passed $13.6 billion for security support and humanitarian assistance to stand with the government of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. The humanitarian assistance going both to country, but also to the surrounding nations that are accepting literally millions of Ukrainian citizens who are fleeing the war zone, and then security support for the implements and defensive weaponry that Ukrainian soldiers can use in repelling the Russian military and Russian aggression. At the same time, we're very, very concerned about preventing World War III by having any direct conflict occur between any NATO nation and Russia directly. And it's so heartbreaking to watch what's going on, but we are standing up. I've not seen NATO and the European Union as unified with the US in support of Ukraine as I have. There's been a lot of fragmentation in NATO, especially during the previous administration. And I think President Biden has done a marvelous job of unifying. Last thing I want to mention before turning to your questions and maybe a look ahead at what we might be doing for the balance of the year. I want to just say that the infrastructure bill that was passed last year is already beginning to be implemented. When I'm home in Wisconsin on weekends or during our recesses, I have been visiting the sites, especially in rural Wisconsin, where there are rural development grants for getting rid of lead laterals and upgrading wastewater treatment facilities, as well as road and bridge repair, highlighting that this was a once in a generation, if not a once in a lifetime investment, that over its multi-year time horizon is intended to bring high-speed broadband service to everyone, is intended to get rid of lead pipes in our drinking water systems altogether, and aimed at fixing our bridges and roads and rail and ports so that we can continue to be leaders in the 21st century economy. So that's really exciting. I'll give you a teaser. I'm happy to talk about our next Supreme Court justice. I'm happy to talk about climate change. I'm happy to talk about a return to at least passing or advancing elements of the Build Back Better budget. So I'll leave it to you to steer me where you'd like to have me go.
Dennis, you're going to take it away there?
Well, I can let you do your usual and masterful job on that, but why don't I do the first one, and that is, what about voting rights? That's a major concern, and that seems to be stalled in the Senate. Yes.
Interestingly, we have every member of our Democratic caucus signed on to the measure we want to pass, which is a combination of the Freedom to Vote Act, which would empower us to challenge many of these restrictive state level bills that have been enacted. And it also has the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would prospectively restore the Voting Rights Act to its full potential, where pre-clearance by the US Department of Justice would be required before a state could advance a measure that might suppress the vote or make it more difficult to vote. And those, by the way, those provisions are provisions that were struck down by the US Supreme Court in recent years in 2 different cases that have made the Voting Rights Act of 1965 much less effective. And so we want to pass both of these because if you only work prospectively, we can't do anything about some of these ridiculous laws that we've been seeing in states that will make it harder for people to vote. But I think also importantly, are changing the way states are contemplating counting the votes and certifying elections, which is terrifying if you think about it. What happened is that Mitch McConnell and the Republicans decided to filibuster this measure. And the result was that the only way we could contemplate passing it is either getting 60 votes to do so, or reforming the filibuster so that we could get to passing it on a simple majority vote. And we were unable to get the votes required to do either, to go down either of those paths. So what happens is the next strategy. I think the next strategy is multifaceted. I think you will see us bring pieces of the Freedom to Vote Act to the floor where we think we might be able to get bipartisan support, or alternatively, to again show the American public who's for a common sense reform and who's not. And that should probably happen in, not this month probably, but maybe later in the spring, early summer. We want to keep people very aware of who's blocking this when they see these common sense reforms that should be taking place. We also want to use the issue as an organizing tool to say, clearly one party is saying, we don't want you to vote. That should give you even more fire in the belly to vote and to organize folks to vote. This is our most fundamental right as a democracy. And so that'll be a key aspect of what we do moving forward.
So there are a couple of questions, Senator, popping up, and one is about the Build Back Better. Can you break it up and do exactly what you just said with the voting right?
Yes. So I think particularly going back to what I was saying about lowering prices, and particularly about trying to lower the price of prescription drugs, I think what you'll see first, as I mentioned before, is a vote on what we hope will be a bipartisan insulin measure to lower the price, out-of-pocket price for people on insulin. But secondly, I think you will see this larger reform allowing Medicare to negotiate come in a new version of our Build Back Better budget. And that, as people know, is part of budget reconciliation, which would only require a simple majority to pass. So it's getting back on track to pass that. Now we do have, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but this budget reconciliation is available to us basically on an annual basis. So we have basically 2 chances to pass bills using budget reconciliation this year. The one that's held over from last year, since we didn't get it across the finish line, and a new opportunity that presents itself this year.
Wow.
I would see the prospect of separating what was all bunched into the Build Back Better budget into two reconciliation packages, one focusing more on clean energy and confronting global climate change, and another that has the elements of the Build Back Better budget that were more focused on social policy, lowering costs for working families, for things like childcare or in-home care for aging parents, universal pre-K, elements like that, including the lowering costs for prescription drugs. So I kind of see a package like that developing, and then a package more on the climate related policies that we can, and focusing, of course, on what we believe we can get 50 members sticking together on, because that will be absolutely key. And so I would see that. I think we will not, you won't see it come before the floor until we have confirmed a new Supreme Court justice, because that will occupy the next several weeks. There might be a couple of other smaller bills, but I think you'll see the potential for those two reconciliation bills to follow on in the later spring.
So have you met Judge Brown, and what do you think her chances are?
I will be meeting with her on March 28th. She has first appropriately prioritized meeting with all the members of the Judiciary Committee. And she has, I think, one more such meeting to go with Senator Feinstein, and then she will have done all of that. She's also met with the bipartisan membership of leadership in both parties. And then she will start meeting with those of us who are not on the Senate Judiciary Committee. You'll note that my meeting will be after her hearings are concluded, but nonetheless, I'm very much looking forward to meeting with her. And as far as my prediction about the path, you know, I'm going to be just very optimistic, and I hope my optimism bears out. If this were a seat that would change the ideological balance in the court, which is now sort of 6 conservatives with 3 progressives or liberals, if you will. I don't know. I mean, I am always cautious about saying 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats, because they would resent being cast like that. We look at the facts, we look at the law, we make our decisions, but we all know the reality here. If this were a seat that was actually changing from, let's say, conservative to liberal, there would be an all-out fight going on right now. But since it doesn't, and since this is somebody who will replace Justice Breyer later this summer, there's not a necessity for a knockdown drag-out. And I think Mitch McConnell, in his mind, also doesn't object to doing this in pretty short order. It will not be as fast as the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, but it will be more expedited than several others that we've seen in recent years on both, nominees from both parties. So I think that Mitch McConnell has an incentive to do it expeditiously, if I may say, without causing too many waves. He realizes that the longer this drive goes on, the more potential for members of his caucus to put their feet in their mouths. And he'd rather perhaps limit that as we move forward. So I think we might see a pretty expeditious and less troubling process where people are taking character pot shots and things like that.
Are you going to endorse in the race against the Dems going against Johnson?
I am not. I think that, well, first of all, I always have to just step back and say, wow, what an amazing field of candidates this is. You know, only one of them is going to win the primary. But this talks to the talent we have, you know, in the wings, ready to step up for all sorts of possible leadership opportunities. And so I just want to say first that I'm really pleased to see that. You know, most of the candidates in the race are friends of mine who I've known and supported in their earlier runs for office, and I want to give them the time to, first of all, you know, I think they've already done this, sort of put together their campaign infrastructure, you know, see how they fare at raising resources to fund their campaigns, follow how they're doing in joint forums, joint appearances and debates, and, you know, see how they're putting their campaigns together. I think that the primary will give them the sort of test that they will need in order to be effective, the nominee to be an effective and strong and successful candidate in the general election. So I'm not too distressed that there's this major primary. I would say that I'm seeing 3, maybe 4 candidates sort of in the top tier, any of whom I think could get the primary nod, become the nominee. And I think it will depend really how they fare over the next couple of months as the public begins to engage. I think the Marquette poll that came out last week shows us that they are largely unknown, with the person who's known the best still being unknown to 77% of the state. And, you know, so things are going to change, and they're going to change a lot. And I don't want to put my thumb on the scale. What I do want to do is work closely with the state Democratic Party, making sure that we don't skip a beat after that nomination occurs. Because, you know, this is one of the stories of my 2012 victory for Senate, is I didn't have a Democratic primary, but there was a big Republican primary. And the victor, Tommy Thompson, came out of that gate with the nomination, but nothing in the bank. And I also think that he, you know, being such a, you know, living legend in the state of Wisconsin, the outside groups didn't think they needed to lend him support, but he lost a good 3 weeks just replenishing his coffers. Mm-hmm. And we were out there, and that's, you know, in a short sprint to the general election, that's 3 weeks is a lot to lose.
Dennis poked a little fun about your colleague, Senator Johnson, yet you two did work together on the Wolf. Are you doing something together on the Wolf stuff? How is it working with him? How did that come to be? Have you agreed on anything else?
Oh, sure. But you know, on the issue of the Wolf, I think in some ways you could argue that we came to the same conclusion, but for a different set of reasons. And one of the things I say to folks who have strongly questioned my position on this and sort of saying that it's unexpected or surprise, first of all, I would say, you know, I strongly support the Endangered Species Act, because it gives states and communities the tools they need to restore habitat, to basically bring an endangered, nearly extinct species back to good health. And I think Wisconsin should be really proud of how we've gone from a dangerously low number of wolves to a really, really healthy number of wolves and wolf packs. In fact, when they were first listed, the gray wolf, there was scientifically based estimates on when they would be considered recovered. And that number is so far below the actual number of wolves we have in Wisconsin right now. It's quite amazing. And my fear for those who support the Endangered Species Act is that those who don't would be able to say it doesn't work anymore. You know, we've recovered this species and we should be proud of that, but they're still listed as endangered, even though we have far more than the science of the day said we needed to have. What's happened with the wolves is this have been caught up in litigation basically for, I think, a decade. And so there'll be a legislative move to delist them, and then in court, they'll be relisted by a judge because they're fighting over the science of what is a healthy population. So that's, you know, in some ways, delisting them is because of my fierce support of the Endangered Species Act and not wanting to give the other side more fuel to try to get rid of it. When it works, we ought to acknowledge that it works and delist the species. I will tell you there's all sorts of impediments in my own view into why this has gone less than smoothly. I was just appalled when the DNR set out a sound management plan, and then the DNR board voted to, I think it's either double or triple the number of wolves without any scientific basis for doing that. This makes it the issue way too political and draws divides that I think are unfortunate. And the only other thing I would say about, you know, sort of the mishandling of the process is that I don't believe that the federal government and to a lesser degree the state government did an adequate consultation with the 11 federally recognized tribes in Wisconsin about the impact. There is a very unique cultural connection between our Native American tribes and the wolf. And we had a sort of one size fits all approach that didn't, in my mind, involve enough consultation. If I had to do this all over again, I would certainly insist upon that. But I kind of got into this, you know, where this was all tied up in litigation. So here we are.
We have 4 minutes left and you're going to go. How about student loans? Are they going to get canceled?
You know, I think it's probably going to be somewhat of a compromise between where members of the Senate are at in terms of urging the president to, you know, cancel up to $50,000 of all remaining student debt, and where the president is at looking at a smaller percentage of that. That's the only way I can see threading this needle right now. Neither side are in agreement, and so perhaps a compromise will be where we end up. There may, one compromise is the dollar amount that could be forgiven. Another compromise might be the wealth and earning of the student themselves and the capacity to pay back.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Well, we always like to get people out here early. Dennis, you want to say thanks and whatever?
Thanks and whatever. No, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We know that you're very busy with some very important kinds of issues, and thank you for your service as well as for spending some time with us.
Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just want to say, Dennis, knowing that I was going to see you, I had all sorts of wonderful reflections about our time on the Comparable Worth Task Force and all of that back in 1985 and 80. Yes, that's how long Dennis has been a mentor in my navigating the world of politics.
Yeah. It's been fun. It's been great.
Yes.
Well,
thank you and take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So I guess that wraps us up, Dennis. Unless you have anything else you want to say, we'll meet in 2 weeks.
Right. And we'll be talking about disinformation. And that is not disinformation. It is true.
Oh, that's bad, Dennis.
I guess it is. Sorry about that.
Thanks, everybody, and sure
Thank you.
appreciate it. And sorry we didn't get to all the questions, and there are good questions. Everything from filibuster to Supreme Court to well, just there's a lot of other things there, immigration, and love to be able to have a question with her sometime, but maybe next time.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
Thank you guys
Bye.
for hosting this.
Thank you.
You bet.
Bye-bye.